Hey guys, welcome back. Or if this is your first time here, welcome in. Go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Pull the blankets up. Adjust the pillow. Do that little shuffle where you find the exact right position and then don't move for 45 minutes. You know the one. Tonight we're starting something a little different. This is the beginning of a longer series I've been wanting to do for a while now. I am calling it the Chronicles of Bone. And no, it is not about skeletons. Well, actually, it is a little about skeletons. It is about the bones of empires, the bones of dynasties, the actual literal bones of kings and queens who were dug up, paraded around, kissed by weeping relatives, and in one truly unforgettable placed on a throne, and forced to receive the bogers of an entire race of an entire, while very much dead. We'll get to that. We will absolutely get to that. But tonight is just the prologue. We're easing in. Think of this as the opening credits of a very long, very slow movie about people who married their cousins and then wondered why their children couldn't chew solid food. Tonight, we're starting at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, in a skinny little country on the western rim of Europe, where a small group of possessive, deeply strange volatiles decided they were going to sail to the end of the world, or die trying. A lot of them died trying. This is the story of Portugal, and of Spain, and of the intertwined royal bloodlines that built the greatest maritime empires in human history, and then very slowly, very genetically, collapsed under the weight of their own family trees. Family trees that, I should mention, look less like trees and more like the zumps. Just circles. Circles all the way down. So let's begin where most stories about the sea begin. With a man who never actually sailed anywhere. His name was Henrique. In English we call him Henry. History gave him the title Henry the Navigator, which is one of the most generous nicknames anyone has ever received, because Henry, and I cannot stress this enough, did not navigate. He did not sail. There is no credible evidence that Henry the Navigator ever undertook a significant sea voyage in his life. He was, in the most charitable possible interpretation, a guy who really liked maps and had enough money to make other people go sailing for him. Henry was born in 1394 in Porto, Portugal. He was the third surviving son of King Pedro I and his wife, Philippa of Lancaster. Now Philippa was English, daughter of John of Gaunt, granddaughter of Edward III. So right from the start, we've got English blood mixing into the Portuguese royal line, which will matter later when everyone starts marrying everyone else, and the geneticists start weeping. No, Henry's father was the founder of the Avis dynasty. He'd come to power in 1385 after a succession crisis that involved, as Portuguesist in Fristi, Oskibound, stabbing. Joa was actually the illegitimate son of Pedro I, which meant he technically shouldn't have been king at all, but the previous king had died. The legitimate heir was married to the king of Castile, and Portugal was not about to become a Spanish suburb. So they picked Runtis because he was available and willing, and not Castilian. Joao and Philippa had a famously good marriage, which in the context of medieval royalty means they apparently spoke to each other voluntarily, and neither one tried to have the other poisoned. They produced several children, including Duarte, who would become King Pedro, who would become a regent, and then a corpse on a battlefield, and our boy Henry, who would become the patron saint of sitting in a room and pointing at the ocean. Henry grew up in a court that was, by the standards of the time, relatively stable. Portugal was small. It had maybe 1.5 million people. It was sandwiched between Spain and the Atlantic. It had exactly two options for expansion: east into Castile, which would start a war, or west into the sea, which would start an adventure. Henry chose the sea, or rather, he chose to make other people choose the sea. After participating in the conquest of Ceuta in North Africa in 1415, which was basically Portugal saying, which was Galsta, of sand, where, country, please respect us, beyond the coast of Africa. Not in a scientific way, not in a purely economic way, in a weird semi-religious, deeply personal way. He wanted to find the mythical Christian kingdom of Prester John. He wanted to outflank the Islamic world. He wanted gold. He wanted spices. He wanted, quite possibly, something to do with his time, because Henry never married. And that is worth pausing on for a moment. Henry the Navigator never married. He never produced any legitimate children. He had one acknowledged legitimate daughter, but the details are furky. 4a. Royal prince in the 15th century. This was unusual. Marriage was basically your entire job description. You existed to produce heirs. That was the deal. You got a castle and a title, and in exchange, you married whoever your parents told you to marry, and you produced children until your spouse either died or you did. But Henry just didn't. He threw himself into his exploration projects instead. He set up a kind of informal headquarters at Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal, where the Jew sort of gives up and becomes ocean. There, according to legend, he established a school of navigation. In reality, it was probably more like a loose gathering of cartographers, sailors, and shipbuilders who Henry funded and badgered into pushing further and further down the African coast. Each expedition went a little farther. Each one came back with a little more information, and Henry sat in Sagres, not sailing, and drew lines on maps. He was, in his own strange way, building an empire from a desk. The first armchair imperialist Henry's sailors discovered, or, more accurately, from the perspective of the people already living there, Bocountant, Medi, the Gazores, and the western coast of Africa as far as modern-day Sierra Leone. They didn't reach the southern tip of Africa. They didn't make it to Inena. Henry died in 1460, decades before any of the really famous voyages happened. Happening Didascobers, India until 1498. Columbus wouldn't bump into the Americas until 1492. Henry missed all of it, but he set the whole thing in motion. He created the institutional momentum. He made Portugal a country that sailed, and in doing so, he planted the seeds of an empire that would stretch from Brazil to Macau, that would reshape the global economy, that would bring imaginable wealth to a tiny kingdom on the edge of Europe, and that would, eventually, be taken apart by the very dynastic entanglements that built it. Because here is the thing about Portugal's golden age. It was magnificent, it was world-changing, and it was run by a family that could not stop making catastrophic personal decisions. Let's float back a few decades, to before Henry, to before Joyoi, to the event that gave this whole series its name. The story of a king, a dead woman, and a crown placed on a skull. The story of Inés de Castro. And the beginning of the bones, right. So Inés de Castro, if you've never heard this story before, go ahead and get a little more comfortable, because it is one of the strangest, saddest, and most disturbingly romantic episodes in all of European history. And I say disturbingly romantic because it involves exhuming a corpse, dressing it in royal robes, and forking a room full of nobles to kiss its decomposing hand, which is a choice. That is a choice a person made. Let's set the scene. It is the 1340s. Portugal is ruled by King Afonso IV, a competent if somewhat anxious monarch, who spent most of his reign worrying about Castile, which is fair because Castile spent most of its existence being worrisome. Afonso had a son, Prince Pedro, who was the heir to the throne. Pedro was, by most accounts, passionate, emotional, and not especially interested in doing what he was told, which, for a medieval prince, was basically a personality disorder. In 1340, Pedro was married off to Constanza of Castile. This was a perfectly standard dynastic marriage. Constanza was a Castilian noblewoman with the right bloodline and the right connections. She would produce heirs, strengthen the alliance, and everyone would be content. Simple, easy, completely fauve. Except Constanza brought a lady in waiting with her. Her name was Inés de Castro. and she was, by all accounts, extraordinarily beautiful. The chronicles describe her with that particular medieval enthusiasm reserved for women who were about to cause enormous political problems. Fair skin, pale eyes, a neck like a swan, you know the type. The type that launches 1,000 diplomatic incidents. Pedro took one look at Inés de Castro and fell completely, irrevocably, catastrophically in love. And not in the polite, courtly love way where you write some poems and see a lot and then go back to your wife. No, Pedro fell in love in the way that makes your father call emergency meetings with his advisors. The real kind. The dangerous kind. For a while, appearances were maintained. Constanza was still the official wife. She even made Inés the godmother of her son, Fernando, which was a strategic move in the Catholic cult. Godparent relationship created a spiritual kinship that technically prohibited romantic involvement. Constanza was basically trying to make Pedro's affair within his a sin so obvious that even he would have to stop. He did not stop. Pedro and Inés continued their relationship more or less openly. Constanza, for her part, kept having children and kept pretending everything was fine, which was the medieval noblewoman's equivalent of posts on social media. She died in 1345, possibly in Chi, Poshoev heartbreak, possibly of the sheebly of the shuction of being married, with someone some scene. With Constanza gone, Pedro didn't even pretend anymore. He moved Inés into the royal estate at Coimbra and lived with her as though she were his wife. They had children together. 4 of them. Pedro showed no interest whatsoever in remarrying for dynastic purposes. He was done. He had found his person, and his person was Inés, and everyone else could deal with it. King Afonso IV could not, in fact, deal with it. The problem wasn't just that Pedro was in love with the wrong woman. The problem was that from the Castro family, which was powerful, ambitious, and Castilian, Afonso and his advisors feared that the Castro brothers' Inés's relatives were gaining too much influence over Ciacin. If Pedro became king with Inés at his side, the Castros would effectively control Portugal. From the perspective of Portuguese national security, this was a nightmare. The little kingdom had spent centuries fighting to stay independent from Castile, and now the heir to the throne was handing keys to a Castilian family because he was in love. Afonso tried reasoning with Pedro. It didn't work. He tried separating them. It didn't work. He tried sending Inés away. Pedro just went and found her. So in January of 1355, while Pedro was away on a hunting trip, King Afonso IV sent 3 of his advisors to the monastery of Santa Clara in Coimbra, where Inés was living. Their names were Pedro, Coelho, Fodi Foro, Gonalves, and Diogo Lopes Pacheco. They came with a royal order, and they murdered Inés de Castro. The details vary depending on which chronicle you read. Some say she was beheaded. Some say she was stabbed. Some say she pleaded for her life in front of her own children. What is consistent across all accounts is that she was killed on the king's orders, and that when Tro found out, something inside him broke. He didn't just grieve. He raged. He launched a brief civil war against his own father. He ravaged the Portuguese countryside. He burned towns. It took the intervention of his mother, Queen Beatrice, to negotiate a peace between father and son. Pedro eventually backed down, but he did not forget. He did not forgive. He just waited. Afonso IV died in 1357. Pedro became King Pedro I of Portugal, and the first thing he did, the very first priority of his reign, was to hunt down the 3 men who had killed Inés. Diogo Lopes Pacheco escaped to Castile and eventually received a pardon years later. But Pero Coelho and Seven Delvaro Gonalves were captured. And what happened to them is the kind of thing that makes you understand why medieval people feared their kings. He had their hearts ripped out. One through the chest, one through the back, while they were alive, in front of the court. Pedro reportedly watched while eating dinner. And then And here is where the story crosses from intense into genuinely unsettling. Pedro announced that he and Ins had been secretly, years ago, in a private ceremony, which meant that an S had not been his mistress. She had been his wife. She had been, legally and sacramentally, the Queen of Portugal, and she had been murdered by agents of the crown. Now, historians have debated for centuries whether this secret marriage actually happened, or whether Pedro simply invented it to legitimize their children. The evidence is thin. The witnesses who supposedly attended the ceremony conveniently came forward only after was kin and in a position to reward them, but it didn't matter whether it was true. What mattered was that Pedro said it was true, and Pedro was the king, and Pedro had recently eaten dinner while watching two men have their hearts removed, so nobody was going to argue. And then came the bones. According to tradition, and this part may be partly legendary, though it has been repeated for so many centuries that it has achieved the status of accepted historical narrative. Castro's body exhumed from her grave. She had been dead for at least 2 years, possibly more. Her remains were dressed in royal robes. A crown was placed on her skull. She was seated on a throne, and the entire Portuguese court was required to file past and kiss the hand of their dead queen. Let me say that again, because I think it is important to let it sink in. Pagupa's dead lover put a crown on her scalet, and made the most powerful people in Portugal canonier, and pressed their lips to bones. This is the origin of this series title. This is why we're here. Because the history of European monarchy is quite literally a chronicle of bones. Bones that were crowned, bones that were kissed, bones that were fought over, bones that were deformed by inbreeding, and bones that were eventually all that remained of the most powerful families. Pedro I ruled Portugal until 1367. He was, by most accounts other than the heart-ripping and corpse-crowning incidents, a reasonably good king. He was known for dispensing justice to commoners, for being accessible, and for keeping the peace. The people called him Pedro the Just, or, alternatively, Pedro the Cruel. It depended on whether you were a commoner, who benefited from his justice, or a nobleman who was terrified of his temper. He was succeeded by his legitimate son, Fernando I, whose reign was a disaster of romantic entanglements and Castilian wars. But Fernando's story is a whole other thing. What matters for our purposes is the line that came after the Aviz dynasty. The family that would take Portugal to the edge of the world, and the family that would, eventually, marry itself into oblivion. Let's drift forward now. The candles are getting low, the ocean is dark, and we have a long way to set sail. So, we've established that the Portuguese royal family had a far erratic corpse queens, heart extractions the usual. But things were about to get more complicated, because Portugal was about to become very, very rich. And nothing complicates a dynasty quite like money. Let's skip forward through a few decades. After Fernando I died in 1383 without a male heir, there was the predictable succession crisis, which is how Joai, the Bordi sin Persic, cruel, just, ended up on the throne and founded the Aviz dynasty. We talked about him earlier. Good king, married the English Philippa of Lancaster, produced Henry the Navigator, and a bunch of other sons with dramatic nicknames and early deaths. The Aviz dynasty held Portugal together through the 15th century. Jordio I was followed by Duarte I, who ruled for only 5 years and died of plague in 1438. Because medieval kings had a tendency to die of things that sound preventable. Duarte was followed by Afonso, who was exhumed when he took the throne, which meant a regency, which meant family infecting, which meant what? Coimbra. Henry the Navigator's brother ended up dead at the Battle of Alfarrobera in 1449. The Aviz family, it turned out, was very good at killing each other. Afonso V grew up to be a king, obsessed with North Africa and crusading. He conquered several Moroccan cities and earned the nickname, the African, which sounded a lot more impressive in the 15th century than it does now. He also tried to claim the throne of Castile through his marriage to Juana la Beltranje, failed miserably, and eventually abdicated in favor of his son, Jotu II, before changing his mind and unabdicating. Just a normal, stable family. Joe II. Now Joe II is interesting. He was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely terrifying. He is sometimes called the perfect prince, which in Portuguese history means the prince who murdered his political opponents with maximum efficiency. Jordi II consolidated royal power by simply eliminating anyone who challenged him. He had the Duke of Bragan executed for treason. He personally stabbed his own cousin, the Duke of Viseu, to death with his own hands in a private meeting. Just walked in, said hello, and started stabbing. Joe II was also a visionary when it came to exploration. He was the one who really pushed the Portuguese voyages forward after Henry the Navigator's death. Under his patronage, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving that you could sail around Africa and reach the Indian Ocean. Jodio II also turned down Christopher Columbus, which in hindsight looks like a mistake, but at the time was probably reasonable, since Columbus's math was terrible, and he was almost certainly going to sail into the middle of the ocean and die. The fact that there happened to be 2 continents in the way was pure luck. But here is where things get dynastically interesting. Joyo II had one legitimate son, Prince Afonso, and Prince Afonso died in 1491, falling off a horse by the banks of the Tagus River. He was 16 years old. He had just been married to Isabella of Aragon, the eldest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, in one of those grand dynastic marriages that was supposed to eventually unite the 2 Iberian kingdoms. Ju was devastated. He tried desperately to legitimize his illegitimate son Argay so that Harsay could inherit the throne. But the queen, Leonor of Viseu, whose brother Joe had personally stabbed to death, which must have made family dinners somewhat tense, refused. She wanted the throne to go to her brother-in-law, Manuel, Duke of Beja. Manuel was Leonor's preferred candidate, because he was from her side of the family. Also, because he was not the son of her husband's mistress. Joe II died in 1495. Possibly of poison, possibly of natural causes, possibly of the accumulated karmic weight of all those stabbings. And Manuel became king. Manuel I of Portugal, known to history as Manuel the Fortunate. And he was fortunate. Absurdly, almost comically fortunate. He inherited the throne by accident. He inherited the exploration program. That was about to pay off spectacularly. Vasco da Gama reached India in 1614, just 3 years into Manuel's reign. Pedro Civizares, Cabral stumbled onto Brazil in 1020. Portuguese traders established themselves in the Spice Islands, in East Africa, in the Persian Gulf. Money poured into Lisbon like the Tunming in Portugal. This tiny country of barely 2 million people suddenly controlled a trading empire that spanned half the globe. Manuel built the magnificent Jeronimos Monastery in Belhawi. He commissioned the Tower of Belém. He funded an explosion of architecture in a style now called Monuline, which is basically Gothic architecture that went on a trip to India and came back with ideas. Twisted ropes carved in stone, coral-shaped columns, armillary spheres everywhere. It was gorgeous. It was excessive. It was the architectural equivalent of a man who just discovered he was incredibly wealthy and wanted everyone to know. But Manuel's personal life. Oh, Manuel's personal life. This is where we get into the kind of mathematics that would make a geneticist. Remember Prince Afonso, Jodio II's son, who died falling off a horse. And remember Isabella of Aragon, the Spanish princess he had married. Well, after Afonso died, Isabella went back to Spain. She was a widow at 17. Tragic, but not uncommon. Manuel, I decided he wanted to marry her. Think about that for a second. His predecessor's son's widow. the woman who had been briefly married to the prince whose death had made Manuel's kingship possible. Manuel wanted to marry her. And not for romantic reasons. For political ones. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain were the most powerful monarchs in Europe, and a marriage alliance with them would secure Portugal's position, and potentially lead to the unification of the Iberian Peninsula under Portuguese influence. There was a catch, though. Ferdinand and Isabella said yes to the marriage, but they had a condition. Portugal had to expel its Jewish population. Spain had expelled its Jews in 1492. Them had fled to Portugal. Ferdinand and Isabella wanted them gone. Manuel, weighing the lives and livelihoods of tens of thousands of Jewish people against a politically advantageous marriage, chose the marriage. In 1496, Manuel issued the decree. But rather than simply expelling the Jews, he tried a somewhat different approach. He ordered forced conversions. Jews who refused to convert were to leave. But Manuel made leaving nearly impossible by restricting access to ports. Children were taken from their parents and given to Christian families. It was, by any measure, a monstrous act, and Manuel did it because he wanted to marry a widow. Isabella of Aragon married Manuel I in 1497. She died in childbirth in 1498, delivering a son. The baby briefly became the heir to Portugal, Castile, and Aragon, which would have unified the entire Iberian Peninsula. Then he died in 1500, at the age of 2. So Manuel needed another wife. And he looked at the Spanish royal family again. Isabella had a younger sister. Her name was Maria of Aragon. Manuel married her in 1500. He married his dead wife's sister. Now, in Manuel's defense, and I use the word defense loosely, this kind of thing was not uncommon in royal circles. You married into a family. The spouse died. You married the next available sibling. It was efficient. It maintained the alliance. It was also the kind of thing that made the gene pool start to look like a genie poodle. But nobody was thinking about genetics in 1500. Maria of Aragon was apparently a much better match for Manuel. Temperamentally speaking, she gave him 10 children, including the future Jodio III. She survived until 1517, which by the standards of Portuguese queens was practically immortal. And then Maria died. And Manuel, now in his late 40s, needed yet another wife. Because kings always need another wife. It is like a law of nature. Gravity pulls things down, and kings remarry. This time, Manuel married Eleanor of Austria, who was the daughter of Castilla, and Philip of Tyre, who was the granddaughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, who was, in other words, the niece of his first 2 wives. Manuel, I married his dead wife's niece. He married into the same family 3 times, each time reaching for a slightly different branch of the same increasingly pruned family tree. He was 51. Eleanor was 19. They married in 1518. And Manuel died in 1521. Leaving Eleanor a widow at 23, she went on to marry Francis I of France. Because why waste a perfectly good Habsburg when there are other thrones to influence? Manuel the Fortunate. Lucky in empire, lucky in gold, absolutely relentless in his determination. Tamardi Spanish Prince, Retis Wartwux Risi Prizikin were to his previous Spanish princesses. And the children of all these marriages. They would go on to marry other cousins, other relatives, other branches of the same handful of royal families, tightening the genetic noose with each generation. The ocean was making Portugal rich. But the marriages were making Portugal something else. Let's drift onward. The candles flicker. The ships creak, and somewhere in Castile, a princess is about to lose her mind. Possibly. Literally. Now, we need to talk about Juana. Because you cannot tell the story of Iberian royalty without talking about Juana of Castile. And you cannot talk about Juana of Castile without feeling a profound, bone-deep sadness that sits in your chest like a stone. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. The same Ferdinand and Isabella who unified Spain, funded Columbus, expelled the Jews and Muslims, and generally reshaped the world in their image. She was born in 1479, the third of their 5 children. She was bright. She was educated. She spoke multiple languages. She was, by all accounts, a perfectly normal and capable young woman. And then she married Philip of Habsburg. Philip was the son of Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, and Mary of Burgundy. He was handsome, extremely handsome. The kind of handsome that got him the nickname Philip the Handsome, which is the most on nose royal CTCT by Lime. He was also, and I say this with all due historical respect, an absolute disaster of a human being. Juana and Philip married in 1496, when she was 16 and he was 18. The marriage was political. It was part of a double alliance between Spain and the Habsburgs, with Juana's brother Juan marrying Philip's Hulsty, Margaret. But unlike most political marriages, Juana and Philip actually hit it off, physically at least. Juana was apparently infatuated with Philip from the moment she saw him. The feeling was mutual. At first, their wedding night reportedly began before the actual wedding ceremony was finished, which scandalized the court, but at least suggested enthusiasm. The problem was that Philip's affection was, shall we say, distributed widely across multiple women. At any given time, Philip the Handsome was handsome, and he knew it, and he saw no reason to limit his handsomeness to just one woman. Juana, who loved him with a desperate, consuming intensity, did not take this well. The Chronicles describe scenes that range from heartbreaking to alarming. But he attacked one of Philip's bistresses with sitiers with sedgers, cutting the woman's hair. She refused to eat when Philip was away. She flew into hysterics when she suspected infidelity, which was more or less constantly, because the infidelity was more or less constant. Philip, for his part, responded to Juana's emotional breakdowns by locking her in rooms and telling everyone she was insane. Was she insane? This is one of the great questions of Spanish history. The traditional narrative says Juana was mitral, post-psychosis, from what we would now recognize as severe depression. She earned the nickname Juana Locana, the Mad, but modern historians have increasingly questioned this. Some argue that Juana's madness was largely manufactured by the men around her. First Philip, then her own father Ferdinand, as a pretext to keep her away from power. A woman who was declared mentally unfit could be locked away while others ruled in her name. And that is exactly what happened. Here is what we know for certain. Juana's older siblings died. Her brother Juan died in 1497, just months after his wedding. Her older sister Isabella, the one who married Manuel I of Portugal, died in 1498. Isabella's son, little Miguel de Paz, died in 1500, which meant that Juana, almost by accident, became the heir to Castile and Aragon. She was going to be the Queen of Spain. Juana did not want to be the Queen of Spain. Juana wanted Philip to stop sleeping with other women. That was her primary concern. The largest kingdom in Western Europe was secondary. Isabella of Castile died in 1504. Juana became Queen of Castile. Philip became king consort. Ferdinand, Juana's father, was supposed to step back, but Ferdinand was Ferdinand. He never stepped back from anything voluntarily. A three-way power struggle erupted between Juana, Philip, and Ferdinand, with increasingly sidelined by both her husband and her father, both of whom found it convenient to describe her as epate to rule. Philip died in 1506. He was 28. The cause was probably typhus, though poison was, as always. And this is where the story gets really dark. Juana refused to be separated from Philip's body. According to contemporary accounts, she had his coffin open-profited, so she could look at him. She traveled with the coffin across Castile, stopping at monasteries and churches along the way. She reportedly would not allow women near the coffin. Even in death, she was jealous. She supposedly had the coffin opened at night and kissed and embraced the decomposing corpse. How much of this is true and how much is propaganda designed to justify her imprisonment is genuinely hard to say. The accounts come from people who had political reasons to paint Juana as insane. But something was clearly very wrong, whether that something was genuine mental illness, extreme grief, or the complete psychological collapse of a woman who had been gaslit and manipulated for her entire adult. Ferdinand took control. He had Juana confined to the royal palace at Tordesillas in 1509. She would remain there for the rest of her life. 46 years. She was 30 when she was locked away. She died in 1555, at the age of 75, having spent more of her life imprisoned than free. During those 46 years, Juana remained the nominal queen of Castile. Technically, legally, she was the ruler. But she ruled nothing. First, Ferdinand governed in her name. Then, after Ferdinand died in 1516, her son Charles took over. Charles became Charles I of Spain and Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful dark in Europe. And he kept his mother locked in Tordesillas the entire time. He visited her occasionally. Mostly, he ignored her. Juana reportedly lived in increasingly grim conditions. There are accounts of her refusing to eat, refusing to bathe, refusing to attend church. Whether these were symptoms of mental illness or the natural responses of a person who had been imprisoned for decades against her will is, again, a matter of debate. She was reportedly mistreated by her keepers. There are suggestions of physical abuse. There are suggestions that she was kept in darkened rooms for extended periods. She died in April 1555. Her death was barely noticed. The woman who had been Queen of Castile, the mother of the most powerful emperor in Europe, died in a palace that had been her prison for near half a century. Let me take a breath here, and you should too. Adjust the blankets, close your eyes for a moment if you'd like. This is heavy stuff. Even when we're talking about it in this quiet, floaty way. The reason Juana matters to our story, beyond the obvious human tragedy, is that she was the bridge between Spain and the Habsburgs. Through Juana and Philip the Handsome, the Habsburg bloodline entered the Spanish royal family, and it never left. For the next 200 years, the Spanish Habsburgs would marry within their own family, with a determination that bordered on the compulsive. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. The family tree doubled back on itself so many times that by the end, it had essentially tied itself in a knot. And the result of all that genetic compression was one specific person. One final, terrible product of generations of inbreeding. A king who could barely walk, barely talk, barely eat, and whose autopsy report would make medical students gasp 300 years. But we're not there yet. We're still in the prologue. We're sailing. The wind is beepery. The stars are out. And we need to talk about the man who tried to own the ocean itself. The actual king of the seas. Philip II of Spain. Born 1527. Died 1598. Ruled for 42 years. Controlled an empire that included Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, half of Italy, the Philippines, vast stretches of the Americas, and assorted other territories scattered across the globe. He was at his peak, the most powerful man on earth. His empire was the first on which it was said, the sun never set. Because it was always daytime somewhere in Philip's domains. Because he had that much stuff. And he spent most of his time sitting alone in a small room. Reading paperwork. Was not flashy. He was not charismatic. He was not the kind of king who welly charges or gave Resinkime speeches or wept it into bouquets with a sparkle in his eye. He was a bureaucrat, micromanager of cosmic proportions. He personally read and annotated thousands of documents. He made decisions about everything. Troop movements, tax policy, religious doctrine, the width of streets in colonial cities. He would receive reports from the far corners of his empire and respond with lengthy margin notes in his cramped, meticulous handwriting. His advisors would send him summaries, and he would send back requests for the full documents. He wanted to see everything, control everything, decide everything. He built the Escorial, a massive palace monastery complex outside Madrid that perfectly embodied his personality. It was grand but austere, enormous but sober. It had a church, a library, palace, all in one. Philip lived in relatively modest rooms within this enormous complex. With the guardiolages religious. He collated them with GIDB SAS. He reportedly owned over 7,000 individual relics, including entire skeletons of saints, which he arranged in elaborate displays throughout the Escorial. The bones again. Always the bones. Philip's personal life was a sequence of marriages that read like a particularly grim chapter in a European history textbook. He married 4 times. Each marriage was political. Each marriage ended badly. His first wife was Maria Manuela of Portugal. She was his first cousin. Her mother was Philip's auntie, and his mother was her auntie Pete. The same aunt, actually. They shared a set of grandparents. Charles, Villa of Portugal were Philip's parents. Didi and Catherine were Mard's parents, and Catherine was Gera's sister. If that sounds confusing, it is because it is. Draw it on paper, and you'll see the circles. Maria Manuela was 16 when they married in 1543. She died in 1545, 4 days after giving birth to their son, Don Carlos. She was 17. And Don Carlos. We'll get to Don Carlos. Don Carlos is a whole thing. Philip's second wife was Mary I of England. Mary Tudor. Bloody Mary. The Catholic queen who tried to reverse the English Reformation by burning Protestants. She was 11 years older than Philip. He didn't love her. He was civil, reportedly, but distant. He spent as little time in Antibes as possible. Mary desperately wanted a child, an heir that would keep England Catholic. She was pregnant, but both times turned out to be phantom pregnancies, possibly caused by uterine tumors. She died in 1558, childless and largely abandoned by a husband who was already planning his next marriage. Philip's third wife was Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess. She was 14 when they married. By all accounts, this was the closest Philip came to a happy marriage. He apparently, genuinely, cared for Elizabeth, and she for him. They had 2 daughters. Elizabeth died in 1568, at the age of 22, during or shortly after a miscarriage. Philip was reportedly devastated. He withdrew further into his paperwork and his relics. His fourth and final wife was Anna of Austria, and here is where the inbreeding chart gets truly impressive. Anna was Philip's niece. She was the daughter of his sister's macha Fangemelian. Philip married his own sister's daughter. His niece, the genetic coefficient of this marriage was remarkable, even by Habsburg standards. Anna gave Philip the son he desperately needed. The future Philip III. She also gave him several other children, most of whom died young. Anna herself died in 1580, at the age of 30. She had been married to Philip for 10 years, and had been pregnant for most of them. All dead. Philip outlived every single one of them, and by 1580 he was alone in his vast Ostadi palace surrounded by the bones of Sati and Descons, of Sorti B and world and trusting almost no one. Let's pause here and talk about something Philip did in 1580 that directly connects to our larger story. In that year, the Portuguese royal line collapsed. Sebastian I of Portugal, a headstrong young king with delusions of crusading grandeur, had gotten himself killed at the Battle of Al-Sur-Qasr-Quiber in Morocco. His great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, took the throne briefly but died in 17 without an heir, because he was a cardinal, and cardinals aren't supposed to have heirs, though some of them certainly tried. Philip II of Spain claimed the Portuguese throne. He had the strongest dynastic claim. His mother, Isabella of Portu, was a Portuguese prince, He also had the strongest army, which in the 16th century was the same thing as having the strongest dynastic claim. Portugal resisted briefly and then capitulated. Philip became Philip I of Portugal, uniting the Spanish and Portuguese crowns. And just like that, one man controlled both Iberian maritime empires. The Spanish Treasures Subis from the Americas, the Portuguese spice routes to Asia, the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean. Philip II was, for a brief and extraordinary moment, the king of the seas. But the seas don't like kings. And kings, it turns out, don't do very well when the seas push back. Let's talk about the Armada. Because you can't discuss Philip, the king of the seas, without discussing the moment the seas told him no. The year is 1588. Philip has been at war with England, on and off, for years. The Protestant queen, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Philip had once considered marrying, after Wentz Tudor's death, which would have been his third English political maneuver, was supporting Dutch rebellion against Spanish rule in the Netherlands, and furtherizing English privateers to Radstads, ships and colonies. Philip had had enough. He assembled the largest fleet Europe had ever seen. 130 ships, 30,000 men. It was called the Armada Invincible. The Invincible Armada. The plan was straightforward. Sail to the English Channel, link up with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, ferry those troops across to Sind, remove Elizabeth, restore Catholicism. Problem solved. The Armada set sail in May 1588. It was late. It had been delayed by storms. Its commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, was a perfectly competent administrator who had no experience whatsoever. He had literally written to Philip explaining that he got seasick and knew nothing about naval warfare, and would please like to not be put in charge of the largest relics. Philip put him in charge. Anyway, what followed was one of the most famous military disasters in European history, and it unfolded with the kind of slow inevitability that almost seems designed for a late-night history narration. So, here we are. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham, with Francis Drake as his second, engaged the Armada in the English Channel. The English ships were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable. They didn't try to board the Spanish ships. They stayed at a distance and used their superior gunnery. The Spanish formation held more or less as it moved up the channel, but it was being harassed constantly. At Calais, the English sent fire ships into the anchored Armada. 8 burning vessels, packed with corn and gunpowder, drifting into the Spanish fleet at night. The Spanish panicked. Ships cut their anchor cables and scattered. The tight defensive formation broke apart. The next day, at the Battle of Gravelines, the English hammered the disorganized ships. Several were sunk. Several more were badly damaged. Medina Sidonia made the decision to retreat, but he couldn't go back through the channel. The English fleet was in the way. So the Armada went north, around Scotland, around Ireland, into the teeth of the Atlantic autumn. The storms finished what the English had started. Ships were wrecked on the Scottish and Irish coasts. Thousands of sailors drowned. Thousands more died of disease, starvation, and exposure. Of the 130 ships that sailed, roughly 65 made it back to Spain. Of the 30,000 men, perhaps 10,000 survived. Philip received the news in his study at the Escorial. His response, according to the Chronicles, was remarkably calm. "I sent my ships to fight against men," he reportedly said, "not against the sea, winds and waves of God." Then he went back to his paperwork. Whether this story is true or apocryphal, it captures something essential about Philip II. He was a man of titanic will and tiny rooms. He controlled an empire of unimaginable scope from a desk, covered in papers, and when that empire suffered its greatest defeat, he simply noted it and moved on. The bureaucracy continued. The margin notes continued. The relics gathered dust. The world turned But the Armada's defeat marked something larger. It marked the beginning of the end of Spanish maritime supremacy. It didn't happen overnight. Spain remained powerful for decades, but the myth of invincibility was broken. And more importantly for our story, it revealed the fundamental weakness of Philip's L. It was too big, too spread out, too dependent on one man sitting in one room, making every decision. Philip's micromanagement, which had been his strength, became a liability when the empire what any single mind could manage. And then there was Don Carlos. Let's float back in time a bit, to Philip's first marriage, to Maria Manuela of Portugal, and to the son they produced, Don Carlos. Don Carlos was born in 1545, and from the very beginning, things were not right. His mother, remember, was Philip's first. Their shared ancestry meant that Don Carlos had a significantly reduced genetic diversity, and it showed. Don Carlos was small, physically weak. He had an oversized head and a hunched back. One shoulder was higher than the other. One leg was shorter. He had difficulty speaking clearly. He was prone to fevers and illnesses throughout his childhood. The Venetian ambassadors, who were obligated to send detailed reports about every European court, described him in terms that ranged from diplomatic to quietly horrified. But the physical problems were only part of it. Don Carlos was also, by most accounts, psychologically unstable. He had violent rages. He was cruel to animals. There are reports of him roasting rabbits alive and blinding horses. He attacked servants. He threatened. He once reportedly tried to throw a servant out of a window because his boots were the wrong size. He went through tutors at an alarming rate because he attacked most of them. Philip tried. He really did. Or at least he tried as much as a man who was running half the world from a paper-covered desk could try. He sent Don Carlos to the University of Alcalá, hoping education would settle him. It didn't. Don Carlos fell down a flight of stairs in 1562 and suffered a severe head injury that nearly killed him. He survived. But many observers believed the injury worsened his mental instability. As Don Carlos grew into his teenage years and early 20s, the situation became politically dangerous. He was the heir to Spain. He was expected to eventually rule the empire, and he was, to put unfit. He began making contact with Effer with MS Worth went. Wanty lent eke himself some sort of independent roulotte. Whether this was genuine political ambition or delusional fantasy is hard to say. Philip took it seriously either way. In January 1568, Philip made his decision. He personally led a group of armed men to Don Carlos's chambers in the middle of the night. He confiscated his son's weapons and papers. He sealed the doors and windows. Don Carlos was placed under arrest in his own rooms. He would never leave. Don Carlos died in July 1568. 6 months after his arrest. He was 23. The official cause of death was listed as illness. A combination of fevers, fasting, and general physical decline. The unofficial theories have ranged from poison to forced starvation to suicide. The truth is probably simpler and sadder. Don Carlos, physically frail from birth, psychologically damaged, and now, imprisoned and despairing, simply deteriorated until his body gave out. Philip did not attend the funeral. He went back to work. The story of Don Carlos would later be romanticized by Friedrich Schiller and Giuseppe Verdi, who turned it into a tragic tale of a noble prince, destroyed by a tyrannical father. In their versions, Don Carlos was in love with his stepmother, Elizabeth of Valois, and Philip imprisoned him out of jealousy. This is almost certainly fiction. There is no credible evidence of a romance between Don Carlos and Elizabeth. The real story is less romantic and more clinical. A genetically compromised prince born of cousins, who was too damaged to rule and too dangerous to ignore. Philip had his heir to the throne arrested and essentially left to die. And then he went back to his paperwork. The king of the seas, ladies and gentlemen, ruling the world from a desk, collecting bones of saints, outliving every wife, imprisoning his own son, and annotating documents in the margins while the greatest empire on earth slowly began to crumble. It is getting late. Pull the blankets tighter. We're almost through the prologue. After Philip II died in 1598, in the Escorial, naturally in his small room, surrounded by his relics, after an agonizing bout of illness that lasted 53 days and involved abscesses, gangrene so severe that his attendants reportedly had to breathe through cloths, the Spanish Empire passed to his son, Philip II. Philip III was the son of Anna of Austria, Philip's niece, wife, and Philip III was fine. He was fine. He wasn't brilliant. He wasn't terrible. He was a man of moderate ability who had the misfortune of inheriting an empire that required brilliance to manage. He delegated power to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, and spent his time hunting and attending religious ceremonies. The empire didn't collapse, but it didn't thrive either. It just sort of coasted, like a ship with no one at the wheel, still moving forward on momentum alone. Philip III married Margaret of Austria, who was his cousin. Of course, she was. Their son, Philip IV, became king in 1555. Philip IV was more intellectually engaged than his father. He was a genuine patron of the arts, a supporter of Velázquez, a man of culture and taste. He was also a man who fathered at least 30 illegitimate children, while his legitimate heirs kept dying. His first wife, Elizabeth of France, gave him several children, but only one survived to any significant age, Balthasar Charles, who died at 16. Elizabeth of France died in 1644. Philip IV needed a new wife. He needed a son, and so, in the Grand Habsburg tradition, he looked within the family. He married Mariana of Austria, who was his niece, his sister's daughter. Again, the Habsburgs had one move, and they ran it every single time. Mariana was 14 when they married. Philip was 44. She had originally been betrothed to Balthasar Charles, Philip's son. She was supposed to marry the prince. When the prince died, the king married her instead. She went from prospective daughter-in-law to wife. Just slid right up a generation on the family tree. Efficient. Mariana and Philip had several children. Most died in infancy, but one survived, a son, born on the 6th of November, 1661. They named him Carlos, Carlos II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, the final product of 2 daries of inbreeding, the end of the line in the most literal possible sense. Carlos II of Spain was born with so many genetic abnormalities that modern scientists have been able to calculate his inbreeding coefficient, that is, the probability that any given gene was inherited from both parents because they shared a common ancestor, at approximately 0.254. To put that in perspective, a child of a brother and sister would have an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Carlos II was, genetically speaking, slightly more inbred than the child of siblings. His family tree had folded so many times that it had essentially become a single point. The fistations were severe. Carlos had the extreme jaw, was so enlarged, and fistations were severe. Carlos had the extreme. He drooled constantly. He had an oversized tongue that made speech difficult. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8. He didn't speak clearly until much later. He was thin, pale, and constantly ill. He suffered from what may have been epilepsy, intestinal problems, and current farfers. His autopsy, performed after his death in 1700, found that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lung core, gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. This is almost certainly exaggerated. 17th century autopsies were not models of clinical precision. It gives you a sense of the man's physical condition. He was, medically speaking, a disaster from birth to death. And yet he was king. He was king of Spain, ruler of a global empire from the age of 3 until his death at 38. His mother, Mariana, served as regent for the early years, and various ministers and favorites ran things throughout his reign. Carlos himself was mostly a figurehead, trotted out for ceremonies, propped up in throne rooms used as a signature machine for documents he may or may not have understood. He married twice. First to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess who reportedly wept when she learned she was to marry the King of Spain. She had seen portraits. She knew what was coming. Marie-Louise was vivacious, charming, and desperately unhappy in the Spanish court. She died in 1689 at the age of 26 without children. Poison was suspected. It usually was. Carlos then married Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess chosen specifically because her family was known for fertility. It didn't matter. Carlos was almost certainly infertile. No children came. The European powers began circling, eyeing the vast Spanish buyer-like Baltiers over a dynamo. Everyone knew Carlos would die without an heir. The only question was who would get Spain. Carlos died on the 1st of November, 1700. He was 38. In his will, influenced by court factions and French diplomats, he left the Spanish Empire to Philip, Duke of Anjou, a grandson of Louis XIII, France. The Austrian Habsburgs objected. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, which engulfed Europe for over a decade and reshaped the continent's power dynamics for a century, all because a family couldn't stop marrying itself. Carlos II, the last of his line, a man whose body was a map of everything that can go wrong when genetics are treated as a political tool, a man who was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because the people of Spain, unable to understand why their king was so sick, assumed he must be under a curse. In a way, he was. The curse was just genetic, not magical, written in chromosomes instead of spiels, passed down through generations of uncle-niece marriages and cousin unions, each one tightening the double helix a little more, until it produced a king who could barely function as a human being. The bones of the Spanish Habsburgs rest in the royal crypt. Beneath the Escorial, Philip II's bones are there, and Philip III's, and Philip IV's, and Carlos II's. They lie in their ornate bronze and marble sarcophagi arranged in neat rows in the building that Philip III designed as both a palace. It is dark down there and quiet, and the bones don't care about empires or inbreeding, coefficients, or who married whose niece. The bones are just bones. So here we are. At the end of the prologue, the candles have burned low. The ocean is still. We started with Henry the Navigator, the man who never sailed but pointed an entire nation toward the sea. We visited the bones of Inés de Castro, the dead crowned as queen. We sailed with Manuel the Fortunate, who married into the same family 3 times and built an empire on spice and gold. We watched Juana of Castile carry her husband's corpse across Spain. We sat in Philip II's study while he annotated his way through the rise and fall of the world's greatest empire. We met Don Carlos, the damaged prince locked away by his own father, and we ended with Carlos II, the final, devastating proof that you can't fold a family tree in half forever without consequences. This is the world that built the age of exploration. These are the people who sent ships to the ends of the earth. Obsessive, damaged, inbred, brilliant, cruel, romantic, delusional, and occasionally quite good at paperwork. They mapped the globe. They connected continents. They come to civilization for 4. And they did it while marrying their nieces and collecting the bones of saints, imprisoning their own children, and going slowly, inexorably mad. The Chronicles of Bone will continue. There are more stories, more bones, more dynasties that wasted themselves into genetic knots. We'll go to England, to France, to Russia, to the Austrian Habsburgs, who somehow managed to be even more inbred than the Spanish branch. We'll meet kings who talked to walls and queens who refused to bathe and emperors who believed they were made of glass. But that is for next time. Tonight, we've sailed far enough. The king of the seas is in his crypt. The ships are in the harbor. The maps are folded up. The world spins on, indifferent to the names we carve on it. Close your eyes. Let the ocean carry you. The bones will wait. Good night, everyone. Sleep well. And if you dream of old kings and dead queens and ships on dark water, well, that is just the history settling in. I'll see you in the next one.